Hello, welcome back from break. I'm Bernard Schwartz. This is Kaveh Akbar, Chris Kraus, and Leslie Jamison. It's a real pleasure to be here with you all. I thought there are a number of ways to begin a panel like this. And before we begin, I wanted to mention there is a wonderful and robust public record of these writers talking to each other over a number of years, personal and public archive dating back as far as 2015. So if you want more, then just Google them. It's been really fun and fascinating to spend some time in that archive and then to have the opportunity to continue it here in Key West. So here's one way I thought we might begin. Course offering 2024, The Self. This is a course focused on building a self on the page. We'll discuss how to create an autobiographical I who feels plural, as we all do, and navigates the built world of prose in surprising and dynamic ways. We'll talk about the rigorous work of turning the personal experience into art. I'm interested in the idea that being interested in yourself deepens your capacity to be interested in others. We'll discuss the constructed self as multiple and simultaneous, hungry and changing, restless and tender, built from scenes and fragments and unspoken vulnerabilities. The self as an illuminating rather than an obstructive presence. That's a course that, Leslie, you taught last year.
Guilty as charged, yeah.
I was wondering what the 2024 meant. I was like, this is all cohering except why 2024? And then, okay, great.
Which I happen to have access to the syllabus of. It's a wonderful syllabus. You can read along with us. But I think that starting with the messiness of the self and how you make art out of it, art or artfully constructed memoir and nonfiction is a good place to begin. And Leslie, insofar as that is sort of your words framing the conversation, or at least my suggested framing of this conversation, I wonder if you would talk about what is complicated and surprising about doing the kind of autobiographical work that you do.
I guess I should start by saying that part of my impulse I had a kind of perverse impulse to call a course just The Self, and I think it partially came from hearing a particular thing, and I never know whether it's a humble brag or like meant deeply in earnest, but sometimes I'll hear people say, I'm just not that interested in myself. And that might really be true, but it often feels like there's an air of like, and if you are, you might want to pick up your head and look around a little bit more. And so I wanted to, among other things, in the premise of the course, sort of challenge the idea that one only that one of the laws of consciousness is if you're paying attention to yourself, you're necessarily paying less attention to other people. When actually just thinking about Nick's beautiful discussion of Baldwin earlier this afternoon, I think there is a great deal of like hatred, misanthropy, racism, you name it, that comes from like not enough interrogation of the self. So it's sort of like maybe you can be interested in yourself as a conduit to being interested in other people rather than this way that they sometimes get treated as a sort of zero-sum equation. I should also say I teach, it's a perfect place to begin because I teach one of Chris's amazing books, I Love Dick, very early in that book, and there are a number of lectures that reference various poems of Kaveh's, so I feel like even if they don't know it, they are already part of the conversations happening in that course. And I think it began really on a craft level with this idea that, you know, when you're writing from or about life, it's never the work of transcription, it's always the work of construction. If you are a character in your work, whether it's fiction or nonfiction, nobody has access to you besides what you build on the page. So in this really craftsman way, it's like you have to build yourself, and the materials by which you do that are the materials of sentences, scenes, details, observation. But thinking about it in that way is a kind of animating way of getting at, yeah, really this infinite, unanswerable question of what is a self. But when you do that work of building an I on the page, it's like, well, what is a self made of? A self is made not only of what it feels, but a self is made of the conversations it has. A self is made of the things it notices. The self is made of the particular way that a sunset against the backdrop of a cruise liner awakens a particular feeling of sorrow. You know, so the questions of craft and kind of building a thing of sentences become these, inevitably, I think, these questions of like, what is this like amorphous, baggy collection of perceptions that we go around calling a self at all?
Chris, yesterday when you were talking, you referred to the Chris Kraus-like character in the latest book, Cat, as a kind of anchor or a guide. I was curious if you'd say more about how you see sort of the Chris Kraus stand-in character across your books, but in specific regard to this latest book. What are they doing there? What's useful about them for you?
Well, I see my writing almost always as a kind of reportage. Since I don't make anything up, per se, I don't invent, it becomes a matter of selection and editing. It's more, for me, a matter of composition than invention. And my character is present in all of these books. Even in my nonfiction work, I would say my character is present, but never as the protagonist, really. And that's why I'm always so resistant to the term autofiction, I mean, let alone memoir, because my character is not really the center or the focus of the book. My character is there as an observer, you know, as a hopefully credible witness to bring the reader along to observe and witness and think about these other things. Other characters, I think, are much more important in my books, in every one of them, really.
Kaveh, I'm interested in Cyrus and who Cyrus is to you now that the book is out in the world, and is this indelible character that we've all sort of come to love. Does he exist independently of Kaveh Akbar, or just talk to us about his invention?
Yeah. First of all, thank you for being so smart and good, and for like being so well versed in all of our work. And it's an honor to be here with these two people who I admire so much. I feel a little like one of these things is not like the others, but will persist.
It's me.
No, that's not what I was thinking. So Cyrus is the protagonist of my novel Martyr, who shares some biographical symmetries with me. He was born in Iran, came to America, grew up in the American Midwest, is an addict, got sober. Cyrus is in earlier recovery than I am, but is also a poet. And so, there are some obvious sort of like superficial symmetries and less superficial, I guess. But the thing about the book is that, I mean, I was talking to Leslie about this a couple days ago, but I feel like everyone in the book is just me in a wig. I mean, I feel like Orchidea, the artist, is me as much as Cyrus is me. It's just she has, because of her subject position, the opportunity to say slightly different things. And I actually think that that's one of the things that is really attractive to me about the novel. I mean, not the novel meaning my novel, I mean the novel meaning like the royal is that, what do I want to say? I think the pathologization of cognitive dissonance in the 20th century has led to a lot of inorganic performances of certainty in the 21st century, as if, you know, like every time I make an ethical action, it is because I am an ethical actor and not because I want to perceive myself as an ethical actor. Whereas those two thoughts are inextricably welded in my head, right? So like every time I do a good thing, you know, my suspicion is that I'm only doing the good thing because I want to perceive myself as having been good, right? And in the novel, you get to have a character do a good thing and feel good about themselves, and then you get to have another character be like, you're full of shit, you know? And like, that is what is really attractive to me. There's a scene early on in the novel where Cyrus is having an argument with his sponsor, and his sponsor is, you know, Cyrus says something to the effect of like, if only I could find an Iranian higher power, a Muslim higher power, like I think that this recovery stuff would really work for me. And his sponsor's like, you're full of shit. Like, you torrent Marvel movies and you play Madden. Like, you're the most American kid I know. And Cyrus is like, do you know how racist that is? And I think that Cyrus is right, and also the sponsor is right. You know, like, it's a shtick. His sponsor says, like, how many pomegranates, like, you've probably spent more hours today just looking at your iPhone than you spent cutting pomegranates in your entire life. But how many iPhones are in your poems versus how many pomegranates, right? You know, and it's like, that's a fucked up thing for his white sponsor to say. Yes, it is racist, and it is also correct. You know what I mean? And like in the space of the novel, I don't have to choose to be like, this fucking guy was right. You know, I can ventriloquize both sides, and that feels very soothing to me in a world where such complexity or bifurcation seems to be sort of sanded away, or the space to accommodate that kind of dialogue seems to be increasingly vanishing.
Well, and I think if I can just jump off of that really quickly, because I love what, to me, one of the things I love about that framing is the way it connects dialogue as a structural feature of narrative text, or a possible structural feature of narrative text, with a kind of dynamic thinking that I think all four of us are interested in. That's like, okay, we might have our first thought or our first reaction to a thing, but what's really most interesting is like the thought that arrives to critique that first thought, or the third thought that arrives to like maybe try to synthesize the warring first two thoughts. And there's a version of this kind of like dialectic, or this like action reaction that takes place wholly inside a self, but like, thank God we don't have to just live in that wholly internal version of it. We get to have conversation and dialogue where first thought is maybe offered to another person, and then they say, well, yeah, but are you missing this? Or you're being too hard on yourself, or you're not being hard enough on yourself. And part of what I've come to appreciate about like scenes in personal nonfiction, but I mean all kinds of modes, is that like, you know, part of what drew me to the essay as a form was like, you know, what E.M. Turan calls like thinking against oneself, like that you can sort of argue with yourself on the page. But what I think I've become even more fond of is like letting other people argue with me. And what you were saying, Chris, about kind of being a reporter of everything, and like if you're just looking around, there's so much to draw from. It's like one of the best pieces of advice I've ever gotten about memoir is like, give other people the best lines. And I think that's really easy if you're paying attention to what other people say, because other people always have the best lines. And I don't have to have self-interrogation just be like self versus self. It's like, no, I can have my friend Kyle swoop in to my kitchen table and say, you're always in kind of some kind of threshold of self-reinvention. And it's her insight, but I get to bring her insight to the page. And that's also a way of sort of complicating my own self-narratives. And I think in that way, it's like, how do we bring in multiple voices and let those multiple voices dramatize some version of what thinking feels like, or that part of being alive?
It's also just more interesting, right? Like if the you adjacent character is constantly getting the best lines and giving the quippiest bon mots, it's hard not to feel like the author is a little bit sort of desirous of that attention for themselves. Whereas like in Splinters, you know, your daughter gets all the best lines, right? Like she's the star of the show, right? And you were talking yesterday in your event about how a question that she asked you about the Minotaur story sort of augured your descent into fiction again, right? And so, yeah. And
she's also, talk about first thought, best thought, last thought. Not only does my daughter have many wonderful lines in life, and some of them I reproduce on the page, but she's also has like a very limited appetite for me trotting out her best lines as anecdotes. And one of the ways I love being called out by her is she'll, you know, if I love the moment where we're playing the board game about the fox who steals the pot pie, and I just love that moment where she says, maybe the fox stole the pot pie because he was hungry, and like every impulse towards like, my abolition philosophy or my relationship to reparative justice. Like, yeah, he fucking stole the pot pie because he was hungry. But I love her for saying, Mom, you're always telling people that I said that. And I was like, yeah, you totally have my number. I'm just trotting you out as kind of evidence of my own, like, transmitted liberal politics. So I feel like she's always one step ahead, even in my relationship to her,
But that's such a more, sorry, I need to stop talking, but that's so much more delicious to read that story of like you recognizing that you've been trotting her out as like, evidence of your liberal politics or whatever, than the story where your daughter is just like so preternaturally woke. You know what I mean?
Which I'm also guilty of.
Sure,
yeah.
Sure. It's just a better story. You were going to say something before I rudely interrupted you.
Yeah. No, I was just going to say, Leslie, that what you say about incorporating your process into the narrative as you confront and describe a subject, that really resonates with me too. I did a lot of writing about visual art over the years, and it seemed to me that really the only way to write about visual art would be to report on my experience of it. Anything else is a kind of imposition, that kind of very alienating, authoritative, old-fashioned voice of imposition of like, this is the truth, this is the law. And in fact, it never is. It's just one person's perception. It always ever is. So to bring that into the text, I think really opens it up for the reader.
Yeah, and I think there's an interesting way that I think sometimes implicating the self in the encounter with a work of art or the encounter with a journalistic subject can be seen as kind of the self or the I getting in the way. And there are many writers who I really admire who think about it in these terms. Larissa McFarquhar, who's does just incredible journalism. She I think always thinks about herself as like an obstacle lurking between the reader and the subject. But for me, it's not organic to how I think about expressing or documenting the world. And I feel very strongly a resonance with what you just said, Chris, around to document or narrate one's own encounter with a work of art or one's own encounter with a subject. It's less about imposition and more about acknowledging that the observations coming are not some kind of objective truth on high. They're the truths of a very particular encounter. And that's both, to me, I think, ultimately a little bit more interesting, but also it feels like I don't want to say it's the only truth because that would be violating the very thing I was just preaching about, but it feels like the kind of truth I'm interested in. Like this is an encounter, it's not the encounter.
Yeah.
Chris, I'm interested in returning to something you said yesterday about feeling a little bit thwarted. The models of Executioner Song or In Cold Blood, when you're in the Iron Range trying to go after this story. I mean, ultimately the book is rich on its own terms, the form being, you're having connected your own childhood with the lives of the youths up there, as well as talking very vividly about the circumstances of your spouse's addiction. It felt to me, though, based on the talk yesterday, that this was something that was not inevitable, that you were maybe trying to do a slightly less Chris Kraus-like book this time, although I could have that wrong. I'm interested to hear you just return to that subject.
A slightly less, what kind of book?
Chris Kraus-like book.
Oh, no. I would never try and, write a book that's it wasn't really the factor. The factor was, proximity and distance. How could I get close enough to these people to write about them? And initially, we're talking about a book where I'm going to a rural redneck community in northern Minnesota, and I'm separated by about half a century in age from the kids who are, connected with this very violent methamphetamine murder. So how can I bring my experience to theirs? How can I bring us closer? And the way that I found was to look back into my own growing up in a similar town, and compare my character at 13 to the girl who was living on the Iron Range. So I was looking, there were vast differences, but I was looking everywhere I could find a similarity, a point of connection.
something you...
The addiction also was very important. In fact, when I was going around talking to people, and I talked to hundreds of people in the community for that book, I would often lead with the fact of living with an alcoholic spouse, living with an addict, because that was an experience everyone up there shared.
Yeah, I mean, you describe earning, and not always successfully, the trust of the people that you wanted to talk about. And I think something that, Leslie, you've written about is showing up and coming back, you know? I was really struck in rereading your work with the essay on James Agee, which then leads to the photographer Annie Appel reaching out to you, who, of course, well, maybe you could speak for a moment about who Annie Appel is, because I think it's a lens through which to see, you know, the work that you all are doing, and I'll return to.
Yeah, well, I love that connection, Bernard, between some of the ways that I write about, I guess, various forms of like durational journalism and durational art making. It feels very connected to your project in this most recent book, Chris, is like what you understand also as a corrective to kind of parachute journalists who come into the Iron Range for a couple of days and want to explain a certain sort of generalized rural struggling psyche. I am really drawn to people who are obsessed, people whose obsessions translates to a kind of inability to let something go, which often in turn translates to like coming back and coming back and coming back. So I was really interested in James Agee's project and his book, Let Us Now Praise Famous Men, which grew out of a journalistic assignment for Fortune magazine to spend time with 3 sharecropper families in Alabama during the Great Depression. And the piece was killed by Fortune magazine. It wasn't the story they wanted to read. It was brutal, and it indicted not just, you know, particular people in a land far away, but an entire American economic system. And I don't think Fortune magazine was interested in that kind of broad-scale indictment. Agee's response, which was beautiful, was to write another 450 pages and make a gorgeous, strange, formally subversive book. So there was a way that, formally and aesthetically, he refused to let the thing go, and that's part of what I was interested in writing about him. Annie Appel is like opposite side, like Agee, to whatever extent he's going to become canonical, he's had a kind of resurgence and gets a kind of attention. Annie Appel is like a total outsider artist, photographer who's basically spent 30 years returning to document the same family. It's a family that lives on both sides of the US-Mexico border. And her relationship to her subjects and the fact that like visiting them once, staying with them for 2 months, like coming back again, coming back for 5 years, coming back for 10 years, coming back for 15 years, like none of these were sufficient to her. Like, I think nothing will be sufficient to her. But this idea of returning to document in her particular form, which is photography, the lives of these entangled family members over time, like, yes, part of my subject in writing about her was like the aesthetics of her photographs, but I think the subject I was really compelled by was like, what is the thing in this woman's psyche for whom it's never enough? Because that never enoughness feels more truthful to me or somehow more accurate than any sense of like documentary or aesthetic sufficiency. Like, it is impossible. It's like Borges in the map. Like, to make a map that shows the whole world, it would have to be as large as the world. Like, what any of us is doing is always partial and incomplete. And Annie, like, taking out, a 4th credit card to go back again feels like this very concrete, abrupt, honest acknowledgement of the fact that it's like will never be enough to document the humanity of her subject. So I think it's that kind of eternal, restless sense of insufficiency that was part of what I was really after.
Your essay did a beautiful thing also about that photographer that she couldn't have done in a presentation of her own work. And I think you really brought out how much she was implicated and how much of her own life became determined to her relationship with these people over time.
Yeah, absolutely, and thank you for that. And I think there's a way that, like, part of what I think your work gets at this too, that part of what can be so uncomfortable about forming any kind of intimacy with people that you write about. I mean, it's one thing when you're writing about people with whom you share life, and that's complex and fraught and vexed and happy to talk about it, to the end of the world. But what I mean is, like, when you come to somebody as a writer and they are your subject, there's still something incredibly emotionally layered and complicated that happens, where there is a kind of trust put in you that I think, even when both people are very self-aware, there's always a hope that the writer will tell your story exactly as you yourself see it, which is not actually what the journalistic act is about. It's about telling the story in a different way than the subject themselves would say it. And I think that, Janet Malcolm, of course, is like one of our great chroniclers of this like vexed transaction, and The Journalist and the Murderer and elsewhere, where she writes about the ways that subjects sort of eternally feel betrayed by journalists. And part of that betrayal is like, I thought you would tell my story as I see myself, and I think sometimes the people pleaser in me always feels like there's something morally corrupt about not telling somebody's story exactly as they would have told it themselves, when of course part of the form is to do exactly this, to tell a different story than somebody would tell about themselves, and hopefully to do that with enough dignity granting and enough complexity and enough kind of seeing all the sides of it, rather than just turning somebody into the fulfillment of a thesis statement, that you're not dehumanizing them, but something about, it's like I've had to learn to try to own that there's a bit of betrayal in it, rather than try to efface that part of the dynamic entirely.
Kaveh, as you discussed yesterday with Patricia and Forrest, you knew you were going to be a poet since you were a kid. Now you're a poet, and you're many things, but a poet, and now a very successful novelist. Something in the book, though, I wanted to ask you about, and what you said earlier reminded me of it, and also this idea that there are sort of multiple characters where they're just you in a wig, right? So you've put into Orchida's mouth the following. You write, I had a friend who was a novelist. One time I asked her about whether she plots out her book in advance and just fills in the details, or if she moves through the story as she writes it. She looked at me and answered instantly like an oracle. Behind me is silence, ahead of me is silence. And I just wanted to hear you reflect on that. Did you feel that way when you were writing the book?
Yeah, I mean, of course. I have so many things that I want to say to you two, but I was also kind of just like wrapped and sitting at your feet. And I mean, yeah, I like that moment because because it's a character quoting someone else, you can have her say something that's like way more gnomic and oracular than anyone would believe coming from her own mouth. But I also like it very much because there's something to, sometimes I've never quite gotten over the fact that if I sit down at a blank page and really try, I will write something. Like it's not going to be Proust, whatever, but I will write something that would never have existed had it not been for me sitting there at that moment. Like not writing is the easiest thing in the world. Everyone in this room is not writing right now, and to move against that entropy and sort of like wring out of the ether, like there are certain hard science. If the apple didn't fall on Newton's head, it would have fallen on someone else's head, right? Like we would have named gravity, we would have found calculus, we would have found the periodic table. But no one would have written Moby Dick had Melville not. I'm getting goosebumps talking about this. Like there's something so fucking miraculous about it. Like I've never been the beneficiary of a burning bush or an angel's clarion trumpet, but like this is the magic I have known, right? Is that I can sit and produce something that no one else in the history of my species would be able to produce. And we can all, like, if we just all shut up for 30 seconds and wrote 3 sentences, they would be unprecedented. It's like how, like, after the 6th move or whatever, every chess game is unique. And that is so magic to me. Like, that is so intoxicating. And also, like, it can be immobilizing, right? When you're sitting in front of a piece of blank paper and you're aware of the intersecting fascisms and apocalypses and genocides happening at the moment, and you have been told constantly about the important job of the writer, et cetera, it can be really immobilizing to write the poem that undoes the legacies of indigenous genocide and the proliferation of nuclear weaponry and chattel slavery and, humanity's greatest hits, carrying us to the precipice of irreversible ecological collapse, right? Like, and you're like, okay, I'm sitting in front of this yellow legal pad and I need to write the poem that will undo all of that. And I think that it is not until one sort of studies history and recognizes that, Rumi and Padakara and Mahadev Yaka and Hafez and, Dickinson were all writing about the exact same things. And if Dante and Milton couldn't figure it out, then Kaveh Akbar is not going to be the one to figure it out, which kind of vents. There's a great poem. The poet Gwendolyn Brooks has a book called Annie Allen, for which she won the Pulitzer in 1949, and there's a sequence of poems in that book called To the Children of the Poor. And the second or third poem in that sequence is called First Fight, Then Fiddle. First Fight, Then Fiddle. And just that formulation, like those 4 words, like the idea, she says, be deaf to music and to beauty blind, win war, right? And this coming from, possibly the most gregarious poet of the 20th century, possibly one of the most famously generous poets of the 20th century, be deaf to music and to beauty blind, win war. The idea that one understand as discrete categories the fighting and the fiddling and not allow one to supplant the other, so that when one writes about, a rural methamphetamine-addicted community in upper Minnesota, or when one writes about the unhoused in their community, one doesn't write, a poem for the unhoused in their community and say, all right, job's done, wrote them a poem, right? Like you write the poem for the unhoused in your community, and then you go buy socks and Cliff Bars and maxi pads and take them to the mission, and like that's how poetry works, right? It points you towards the action but it doesn't supplant the action, right? That those 4 words, first fight, then fiddle, I feel like get me past that sort of immobilizing. G.K. Chesterton called it the vertigo of the infinite, and he used that to mock, like he used it as a term of derision to talk about writers like me who are like, but I really like it. Like I feel like I can sort of that's what it does feel like, right? The vertigo of the infinite, right? I think that however sort of pejoratively he meant it, I feel seen by it.
Yeah, and well said, yeah. I'm interested, Kaveh, you're eminently quotable. You've in interviews referenced Zbigniew Herbert, another major political poet.
Post-war Polish great poet. But he's also related to the metaphysical poet George Herbert. Weirdly, it's like a weird. Sorry, it doesn't matter, but it
matters to me.
Yeah, I mean, like Zbigniew Herbert was like a distant relative of George Herbert, the metaphysical poet, Easter Wings.
Yeah, but sometimes
that's the end of the fact. Sorry, I just think it's interesting.
But sometimes it was directly political, and other times through the side door. But I'm interested in this formulation that you've borrowed from him, which I've seen you talk about in a couple of ways, as just a way of volleying a question back over to Chris and Leslie. The cat versus the ox. Would you tell us about the cat writer versus the ox writer?
With great zeal, and so Zbigniew Herbert is one of the sort of cadre of post-war Polish greats with like Szymborska and Milosz and Zagajewski, who's a little bit younger, but and Innes were. But he wrote a great sequence of poems called the Mr. Cogito poems. Like the Envoy of Mr. Cogito is like one of the 50 greatest poems of the 20th century. If you take one thing away from what I'm saying, take away to go read the Envoy of Mr. Cogito. But he had this formulation saying that all poets were either cat poets or ox poets, and the ox poet is the poet who's like dutifully pulling the plow. Every day they're out in the fields. No matter how rusty the plow, no matter how cold the soil, they're just out there, hacking away at it. And then the cat poet is the poet who patrols the house and, surveys out the window and takes important naps on the couch. And then, like a mote of dust catches the light and they pounce on it, right? And that's sort of inspiration. Wildly, I was just talking about this with Leslie and Eli earlier today, so this is the uncanniness, but I guess I talk about it a lot. But this is the beginning, and like any binary, it's reductive, but you do find that, a lot of writers fall in sort of one category or the other, one side of this or the other. And so that was Zbigniew Herbert's formulation, but I want to add that my spouse, transcendent American poet and prose stylist Paige Lewis, when I first started batting my eyelashes at them, I asked them this question, like, are you an ox poet or a cat poet? And without missing a beat, they were like, I'm a porcupine poet. I was like, yeah, sure, okay, what is a porcupine poet? And they said that in medieval bestiaries, the porcupine was said to go into like the strawberries or the berry bushes and roll themselves around in the quills, right? And get all the berries stuck to their quills, and then they would go back to their young, and the young would eat all the berries off of the quills, right? And so they're like, talk about like constellating the self, right? They said, I'm a porcupine poet, right? I go to the books and I go to the dead and I roll around and then I come back to my poem and I feed it, right? I was like, I'm gonna marry this person.
And you did.
All right, so Chris, Leslie, ox, cat, or porcupine. Do you self-identify with any of those categories?
Well, who wouldn't want to be the porcupine?
It's really the best answer, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I would have, pre-Page Lewis, I might have said I'd love to think of myself as a cat, but I'm probably more of an ox.
Yeah.
Or like maybe, before I had a kid, I was more of a cat, and now I'm more of an ox. I mean, I will say the only animal I've ever really had a profound, honest moment of identification with in my making is like a tree frog, for a very specific reason. That Kaveh knows, but not to be too mysterious about it, I became fascinated by this species of Amazonian tree frog that uses it in order to fertilize a kind of clutch of eggs that is like in the crook of two tree branches. It goes to like form other relationships, like sort of pseudo relationships with other tree frogs, and then uses those eggs as fertilizer for the initial crop of eggs. And I sort of feel that way about so much of my work. It's like drawing on all the things of this world to kind of bring those eggs back to like one little clutch of eggs that holds like personal experience, cultural criticism, the history of the world, like all the writers I love, and that kind of like gathering together in one big basket is the only way I've ever really known how to write. But I do think what I feel is important about identifying as an ox, even when it's not the sexiest kind of writer to be, is that I used to believe that like genius or authenticity or like a kind of profound relationship to the things of this world wasn't so much about intention and work, that like if you were to have an insight or to be a brilliant person, it was about having these like grand flashes of meaning or awareness. And I'm sure it does work like that for some people, but what I've grown to sort of understand is like my way of finding any kind of insight in the world is more this like showing up for experience and the ways that experience is kind of going to break me in, and that ultimately I think is more the work of the ox than the cat. But that said, I want to read all the oxes and all the cats and certainly all the porcupines. So.
Thank you. I just got the signal from Ben that we're going to do some audience questions. If we could bring the lights up, and you have to self-identify as an ox, a cat, or a porcupine before asking.
We have a question here in the front.
Hi, thank you, everyone. Hi. This question has come up a couple times this weekend, the idea of truth, my truth, someone's individual truth. And I'm wondering how you would define or differentiate truth from perspective or context.
What's your name?
Sean.
Thanks, Sean.
I was joking, but
I'm pedantic.
Chris, do you want to take that one first? Did you hear the question?
Oh, yes. I don't know exactly the conversations that are behind that question, but to me, truth is always fluid and subjective and changing. I mean, there's never any absolute truth, and the attempt to impose one is ridiculous. So, yeah.
But you've also said, I mean, not but, in the sense that this isn't a contradiction, but you've said, to tell the truth about something, you have to have the facts, right? And that's where I think one of my interests in your work lies is, what do you mean by fact, and how you go about gathering them?
For me, accuracy is, I think accuracy resonates more than the word truth. Mm-hmm. Accuracy means just kind of pinning down precisely exactly what it is. Conveying that as accurately as you can. And that's, from the first time I started writing. I mean, I always thought maybe I'm not this kind of great writer who, with all these metaphorical flourishes, but I can try and be accurate. I think anyone can.
Yeah. Kaveh, do you or Leslie want to add to the response to the questioner from the questioner?
Yeah. I mean, I can't improve on what Chris said. But I will say that the idea of objective truth is, I mean, I don't know, you guys have all read Hegel, but one thing, maybe what I can say is that a person that I like reading very much is the cultural critic Frederick Jamison, who passed recently, and he, before the advent of the internet and stuff, would talk about hyperspace meaning the kinds of cities in which we will live in futurity, and he described that the evolution of hyperspace is, in other words, the world in which we live, basically, the cities in which we live, but the world in which we live by extension. He said that the evolution of hyperspace is evolving faster than our sensory apparatus, than our sensory organs, right? And thus, humans needed to, and this is his famous maxim, humans needed to grow new organs, right? We just needed to grow new organs. In other words, like I have 270-degree vision as a sighted person with, and so I'm, at any given moment, I'm missing, a quadrant of experience, right? And in order to perceive everything fully around me, I would need to grow a new organ, right? And I think constantly about that vis-a-vis subjectivity, right? The idea that I can be as, I can say as precise and pure, this is a pen, right? But if I write a book that says this, if I write in a sentence, this is a pen, I will reveal that I'm a sighted person. I will reveal that I'm an English language speaker, right? Which already puts me in a tiny minority of human beings, right? And so like there's no, the performance of objectivity is, a rhetorical flourish as much as anything, right? But I think that it also allows one to, well, yeah, maybe I'll stop there.
There's a person.
Yeah, we have a question here.
Thanks. Hi. Actually, want to talk about endings of novels. Lots of people in real life have really difficult lives, and then they die horrible deaths. And I was wondering if you feel a responsibility to end your novel on a high note in some way, or or with some closure, with give your readers something more than my character fell apart and there's nothing we can do about it.
What's your name?
Sharanya.
Sharanya, it's a beautiful name. It's nice to meet you. I've written exactly one novel.
Well, to me, the best
But it
ending.
has a happy ending.
To me,
Chris, go ahead. I cut you off, please.
yeah, to me, the best ending of a novel is kind of bitter and paradoxical. I always like an ending to a novel that can be read multiple ways, so that if necessary, you could continue, you could pick it up and explicate it in the sequel, in the next book. But no, conclusions are always very artificial and false. And if you can I think it's a matter of kind of bagging what the open question is at the end and then laying that out on the page. That's what I try and do.
I guess it might not be an answer to your question because the craft conundrum that I'm going to reference was a work of nonfiction, but one of my books is called The Recovering, and it's about addiction and recovery and creativity. And from very early on with the book, I knew that I wanted it to work in some way structurally like a recovery meeting, which is to say it would tell many stories rather than just one, and have many voices inside of it rather than just one. And really one of the reasons I wanted to do that was because I could not write a book about addiction that had only one ending. Some people get sober and then they relapse and they die, and other people get sober and they stay sober for the rest of their lives and get to hug their grandchildren at their deathbeds. And to write a story of addiction that had either one of those endings or the other, or another singular ending entirely, just would feel false to me in a way that somehow felt different from, like, every book, right, has an ending, it has a final line, there's a singularity to that final line. But somehow with addiction, maybe because it was so close to my heart, I really wanted to be able to tell a story where it was like John Berryman's life has a very different ending than Billie Holiday's life has a very different ending than, the end of my personal narrative in the book. And so there was actually something that felt refreshing about being able to tell multiple stories and then show the very different ways they went. But I think that's one formal response to that very kind of urgent problem of feeling and living that you name. And I think every book kind of poses its own formal questions, and you have to figure out how to come up with an imperfect response to them.
I have a question over here.
Hi, thank you guys so much. So I loved hearing you guys talk about your hope for yourselves as authors, or not to put that on you, but kind of the removal, the constantly shifting, identifying yourself in various wigs, or different authors talk about this constant removal of the mask, mask after mask, and you're just trying to find yourself. I think Stevenson or someone said that. I was wondering, do you ever feel frustrated at your inadequacy to truly unveil that reality? And then two, though, this is my real question. What are you hoping from your readers? Are you hoping that they see you? What are you hoping that we find from reading that unveiling?
What's your name?
Anna.
Thanks, Anna. Yeah, maybe I can. So, those are two very big and very different questions. I'll try to answer them. The inadequate, Leslie spoke about this earlier, the eternal inadequacy of language, but that's I think all of the art that I love best can be viewed through the lens of the artist signifying the limitations of their medium to express the explosively catalytic psychospiritual event to which they're actually, there's a line in a Brian Eno book called A Year with Swollen Appendices, Brian Eno, the musician, where he's describing the sound of Billie Holiday's voice, or some I don't remember, it was some old jazz singer, Sarah Vaughan maybe, and he says, and he's talking about listening to her voice on a vinyl record, and he says the sound of listening to her voice crack on a vinyl record when she hits a high note, the sound of listening to her voice crack was the sound of witnessing emotional events too momentous for the medium assigned to record them, witnessing emotional events too momentous for the medium assigned to record them, which is also kind of what Lorca is talking about with Duende, or, a lot of artists come at that idea differently, but that crack, the way that time marbles itself into Sappho, or the way that, Coltrane's High C, right? You can look at any great, Rodin's thumbprints all over his sculptures, right? You can look at any great artist and talk about the way in which they're using the medium to signify the insufficiency of the medium, right? And for me, working in language, I love visual art, I love music, but I am a language artist, right? One thing that language is really, really, really bad at representing is simultaneity. You look at a Jackson Pollock, and the entirety of the text enters your ken in one instant, right? You can move your eye around the canvas, right? But the entirety of that text is, if you're a sighted person, the entirety of that text is entering your field of vision at once, right? If I hand you a haiku by Basho and I hand you the Bhagavad Gita, you're aware that they're different durational experiences, but that's about the extent to which you can have a relationship to the text without actually reading you know what I mean? And to truly say here is my consciousness would be, in this moment, I'm having a lovely, lovely time. I'm a little bit intimidated by sitting next to Chris. I'm glad to be sitting next to my friend Leslie. I'm having a wonderful time. I went to the beach. My spouse is right there. I'm really glad to be here. And the country in which I was born is in sort of open revolt right now, and there have been multiple concurrent genocides happening for a long time, and I'm vaguely aware that I need to use the bathroom right now, and I'm aware that there's a sign. You know what I mean? And this is all happening in the exact same moment. You know what I mean? To pretend that I am thinking only one of these things at any moment is a performance, right? The entire performance of this kind of monocognition, right, is entirely. inconsistent with my experience of consciousness, right? Grammatical language can only be ordered sequentially, right? The true novel that I want to write is, a 90,000 word text in which every word is written over every other one, so it just appears as like a word-shaped black bar. You know what I mean? Like, because that is the concurrentness that I actually feel in any given moment, right? Short of that, what I can do is try to move very, very associatively and try to hold the reins loosely, right? So that I can create, I can sort of throw flour on the ghost of the self, right? Like each little detail is like a little grain that I can like sort of use to show you the negative space that the self occupies, right? Because, I'll shut up after this, but like the Chomskyan neurolinguists say that the way that human language distinguishes, and sorry if you're an actual linguist out here, and I apologize for my like 8th grade understanding of this, but like my understanding of it is that, human language is recursive in a way that no animal languages, right? So I can say like the man on the stage with the shoes, or I could say the man on the stage with the shoes and the pen. I could say the man on the stage with the shoes and the pen and the what, right? And I could just do that infinitely until I'm describing like the atomic position of every, but that doesn't seem, again, like it requires, that requires sequence, right? Like to be precise in that way, it requires sequence and duration, right? And by the time you get to the last atom of me, the first atom of me will have moved, right? And so every moment that I'm saying, I'm having a nice time, I'm not saying open revolt in the streets of Tehran, right? Every time I'm saying open revolt in the streets of Tehran, I'm not saying that I had a really, really lovely meal with my spouse last night. You know what I mean? Like the performance of monocognition is totally inconsistent with my experience of having been a human being, and yet my medium is yoked to this cardinality, right? Like this sequence. So I didn't answer the second part of your question, but I've talked too long already, so.
Well, I don't really want the reader to see me as much as I want the reader to see what I see. That's what I try and do.
That's what I was trying to say. This is why I'm like sitting at her feet.
I couldn't top Chris. I think that's a great. Are we?
Ben, are we good?
Yes. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Oh, that's it. Oh, shit. Okay, great. That was so great.